Hello there, fellow gamers. This is DM Nell, and I'm back with another Tonight We Game. And sorry about shouting in your ears like that, but that's how we roll whenever I have a game night. And so yeah, that's my call sign. That's my call to arms. So anyway, back with another episode of Tonight We Game, and this is episode 8, I believe. And I'm going to continue talking about Shadowdark because that is the game that I'm currently running for my in-person team, my in-person group. And let's see, I have been running this now for about 4 months since spring, and it's growing on me. It's not at the level of Shadow the Demon Lord as of yet, but it is definitely a solid game. And my last video, I went into a lot about what I thought about the game, and I had some experience with it at that point, but not as much as I do now. And I still back up what I said in my previous video for the most part, but in this video, what I would like to do is talk a little bit more about the game itself and how it runs, and some frequently asked questions that have been, coming up and have been shared on the Arcane Library Discord. Okay, so like I said, I've been running this since spring, and I have a group of 9 players, and this game is pretty perfect for that size group. It is just really easy to run a combat encounter with 9 players because it's super fast. You just go around the table, and I think most it would take about 5 minutes to get around the table, because this game does not bog you down with a lot of distractions and interruptions that are found in other fantasy RPGs. So what fantasy RPGs love to do, they love to give players or characters, they love to give characters all kinds of options that break the rules or that bend the rules. And so the rules might be you get one action and a move on your turn, and that's it. But you also get, as a fighter, a bonus action, or you might get a reaction for an attack of opportunity. Or you might be able to cast a spell that doubles your actions, or you may get doubled actions as a class feature. So those are the ways that games like D&D and Pathfinder find to provide characters, interesting and pretty cool powers. But the cost of that for the game itself is significant, because whenever you introduce game mechanics that cause the action economy to break, then you start bogging the game down substantially. And what I mean by that is essentially, you're going in initiative order. So it is Joey's turn over here, and Joey's going to go. He does his action and move, done. Then it is Tina's turn over here. She does her action and her move, done. Then we get to Billy Bob Thornton over here, and he does his action. But Joey over here has an ability that allows him to act when a certain trigger occurs, and Billy Bob Thornton does that trigger. Does that trigger, and Joey over here gets to do something. So it interrupts the action economy. Or Billy Bob is next, and then it comes to the DM. The DM, is running his monsters, and he goes to attack somebody. However, Tina over here has an ability to interrupt the monster and do some form of bullshittery attack, and that it just interrupts the flow of the game. It interrupts the action economy, and it really is a huge distraction in my estimation, in my opinion. Now of course in those types of games, players feel super heroic, and they are, because they're essentially superheroes, because they are constantly breaking the rules with all these class features that they have that enable them to do that. And that's great, for those types of games, for those types of systems. That is why people are attracted to those games. However, the drawback to that is that a combat round can take 15 minutes. And, by the time player A gets to player D, back to player A, 15 minutes, it just loses the attention span of everybody at the table. So that's my gripe with, other fantasy role-playing games, but that is what Shadowdark fixes. It keeps the action economy simple. No characters can do more than an action and a move during their turn. There are no bonus actions. There are no reactions. There are no interrupts. Nothing like that occurs during this game. So that keeps the game flowing. It keeps the combat going. It keeps things moving along. And that is, I think, the biggest boon that this game offers playgroups, especially large playgroups. Now, if you run games for smaller groups, say 3 or 4 players, you can afford to incorporate some of those rule-breaking mechanics and still have a fairly quick combat, because you have fewer players. But the more players you have at your table, the more people you have to go through and cycle through during a round of combat, the harder it is to incorporate complexity into your game without it bogging down the game such that everybody at the table gets bored. So that is one of the main reasons why I'm using Shadowdark for my current in-person game. Got 9 players. If everybody shows up, there's 9 people there, and it's just super easy to go bam, 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 all the way around the table, get through a combat in a reasonable amount of time, and keep everybody engaged. And that, I think, is the key. Okay, so that is my sales pitch for Shadowdark. I think it's a fantastic system, particularly for large groups, and even for smaller groups. It doesn't detract with smaller groups, but I think with smaller groups, if you wanted to incorporate more things into the game, you could do that without sacrificing the rate of play. Okay, having said all of that, I really wanted to talk today about the rules of the game and some questions that come up. This is a super rules-light game. However, whenever you have a super rules-light game, now I got the hiccups. Excuse me. Now, with super light games, you have questions that come up. Because a role-playing game is always coming into situations, or you have situations develop for which there is no clear answer in the rules. And sometimes the rules themselves are just too simple to really make clear what the intent is. So because of that, there is an FAQ that was developed and placed on the Arcane Library Discord server. And I want to go through those questions and just kind of talk about some of those things that I've found in my game, and some things that haven't really affected my team. But anyway, this is the Discord server, the Arcane Library Discord server. And if you're not part of this and you're wanting to play Shadowdark, run Shadowdark in particular, I strongly recommend that you sign up for this Discord server, because it's got really good information, a great community, and like I said, this FAQ here in the Shadowdark Rules Forum. So common Shadowdark RPG questions is the top item here, and it's been pinned here by the administrators. And when you open it, it's got a list of the questions that have come up frequently. as you might imagine with FAQs. So what do we got here? We have a bunch, and so let me start at the top and work my way through, and just kind of stop as appropriate to give my commentary. So let's see here. Folks, another Arcanist fell victim to mechanical presumptions based on prior experience with Shadowdark adjacent game systems, and they inquired about other gotchas. So here are some gotchas that you could potentially avoid by going through this list. So the first one, stat modifiers are not added to weapon damage rolls. This is big because most other fantasy RPGs, when you have a stat modifier, you typically apply that to, if you're in combat, let's just use strength as the example. You're making a melee attack roll. Strength is your primary modifier that you would add to that attack roll. So you not only add it to your attack roll, but you add it to your damage roll in other fantasy RPGs. That's not the case in Shadowdark. In Shadowdark, you only add the strength modifier to the attack roll. You do not add it to the damage roll. The damage roll is strictly the weapon damage die plus any class features. Now, class features are important because the class feature could provide you additional modifiers to add to your damage and attack rolls also, but particularly to damage. And that is where you get additional things to add to damage rolls, but you never add the stat modifier to your weapon damage rolls unless your class feature tells you to do that. So that's the core rule. Stat modifiers are not added to weapon damage rolls. The next bullet point, con modifier is only factored into hit points for level 1. Now this can be really confusing because you're rolling up your character at level 1. I'm assuming you roll up your character at level 1. You're not doing the level 0 funnel. And we'll talk about that in the next bullet point. But assuming that you're rolling your character up at level 1, the rules tell you to add your con modifier to your hit point roll for that first level. However, you don't do that for subsequent levels. You only roll your hit die for your class for your hit points after level 1. You don't add your con modifier. Now, as a player, are you going to know that? Especially if you don't have a copy of the rule book, which hasn't been published yet. So anybody that's playing now probably doesn't have a copy of the rule book, player-wise. So that is an easy thing to get wrong, or for players to assume that, well, if I added it at first level, I should be adding my con modifier to my hit points at every level. Wrong. You only add it at first level. You do not add it to subsequent levels. The next bullet point is a 0 level character that becomes level 1 replaces their hit points entirely. So if you're doing the 0 level funnel, it's kind of like a game unto itself. Those of you familiar with Dungeon Crawl Classics, it has a 0 level funnel. A 0 level funnel is essentially you have a bunch of 0 level characters. They don't have a class, and so they're basically a person with a weapon, just a normal person, a commoner of sorts, with a weapon and very, very minimal hit points. And they go through a funnel adventure, which is essentially a meat grinder, and whoever lives at the end of the meat grinder adventure can go on to become a first level character. Now that only, again, that is an optional rule. That is not a core assumption of the game. So you may not always be doing that, just depending on how your game master and your table wants to start off that campaigns. But if you do the funnel and you start with a 0 level character, the hit points that you have at 0 level are only for 0 level. Once you level up to level 1, then you replace your hit points entirely. You re-roll your hit points, you add your con modifier at that point, and that becomes your hit points from that point forward. You don't roll your hit points and add them to your 0 level character hit points. Basically, that 0 level character hit points, after 0 level, after you hit the first level, they don't matter anymore. You just erase them, start fresh with your first level hit point roll, and go forward from there. All right, stat modifiers are based on 3rd edition D&D and onward. All that means is that starting with 3rd edition, the stat modifiers for ability scores have a defined progression. And that progression is you have, let's just start at 10. If you have an ability that is 10 or 11, then your ability modifier is plus 0. If you have an ability score that's 12 or 13, then your ability modifier for that ability score is plus 1. If you have an ability score that is 14 to 15, then your ability modifier is plus 2. 16 to 17 is plus 3, and 18 plus is plus 4. If you go the other way, 8 to 9 is minus 1, 6 to 7 is minus 2, and so on. So that is just a standard progression for ability score modifiers, and all this bullet point is saying is that this game uses that progression, with one exception. The progression stops at 18. You do not increase the ability score modifier beyond 18, which is the next bullet point. Stat scores are not capped at 18, but the modifiers don't increase beyond plus 4. So one of my players asked, well, what's the point of having ability scores beyond 18 if the ability modifier doesn't increase beyond the plus 4? So your character can somehow acquire a strength of 20, but their strength modifier stays at plus 4. What's the point of that? So the point of that is, first of all, you stop the progression at plus 4 to those are the constraints of the game, to keep it from spiraling out of control like other fantasy RPGs do. So the game master can plan around the fact that all players' maximum ability modifiers are going to be plus 4. You're not going to have a character that has a 25 strength that's sitting there with a plus 8 ability modifier. My cat's knocking shit over here. So those are the constraints of the game. Now, if that's the case, you might say, well, why not just cap ability scores or stat scores at 18? Well, here's the reason why. There are creatures that can do, in Shadowdark, that can do damage to your ability scores. Mostly undead creatures. There are also other things like I think poison or some diseases can also affect your ability scores. And so if your ability score is high, then those things that can attack and cause damage to your ability score will be less impacting if your ability score is high than it would be for somebody whose ability score is low. So let me give you an example. You got a fighter with a 20 strength, and they get hit by a vampire's blood drain. So now all of a sudden their 20 strength is 19, or potentially lower. So if that were the case, if that fighter's strength was 18 and they got drained down to 17, well, now their ability score modifier for strength is not plus 4, it's plus 3. However, if you have a strength of 20 and you're drained down to 19, your ability score modifier doesn't change, it's still plus 4. It only drops to plus 3 when you get below 18. So that's the benefit of having a high ability score to defend against those types of effects that directly attack your ability scores, which is another thing I really like about this game, because I think ability scores should be a factor in, and should be something that can be targeted as as something that can take damage and can cause characters to become weaker. Now, that shouldn't be the core of the system, but it should be something that can be an exception to the core to the system to make the game deadlier, or to make it at least more challenging. So another reason why I like Shadowdark is because you take hit point damage, you can get healed by your cleric, no worries. You take ability score damage, all of a sudden you start because you know, that doesn't come back so easily. And you know, clerics aren't going to be able to, you know, as easily repair your ability score damage as they would hit point damage. So that is, you know, that's definitely a thing in Shadowdark. So anyway, that's those 2 bullet points. The next one is spell slots don't exist. So you can continue to cast a spell, you know, as long as you successfully roll to cast it. Not sure why this is in here, because it's clearly defined in the rulebook. But again, at this point, the rulebook hasn't been published, and players probably don't have a copy of it. So, you know, the DM may tell a wizard player or a priest player that they don't have spell slots, but somebody who is playing a wizard or a priest that is you know, used to doing that with D&D or Pathfinder, they're used to the whole spell slot system now, and they might assume that something similar is in place in Shadowdark, but it's not. You are not defined by how many spell slots. The number of spells you cast a day is not defined by or limited to the number of spell slots you have. You can cast a spell all day long, provided that you are able to make a successful casting check. So this game assumes that, you know, casting a spell is difficult, especially under duress, such as in a combat scenario, and so you may fuck it up, and that is represented by a failed spell check. And if you fail your spell check, of course, you lose the spell according to the core rules. But if you cast it successfully, you can keep casting it. You can cast Magic Missile all day long as you make that spell check. But the minute that you fail the spell check, you lose the spell. Now, I have a house rule, and I mentioned this in my last video, which I prefer to the core rule for Shadowdark. And I'll only mention it here because I think that it is a fair way to modify the core rules for Shadowdark without breaking the system. So my house rule is that a player character can, that is a caster, whether a wizard or a priest, they can continue to cast spells even if they fail their spell check. If they fail their spell check, they don't cast a spell. The spell doesn't go off because they messed it up, but they don't lose the spell. Instead, the penalty for messing up a spell check is that obviously the spell doesn't go off, but also that the threshold for a miscast or having to do penance, if you're a priest, grows from a natural 1 to a threshold of 1 to 2. So that's the first time you fail a spell check. The second time you fail a spell check, your threshold increases again to 1 to 3. So every time you fail a spell check, that threshold for a miscast grows, meaning the chances that you're going to roll a miscast increases by 5% every time. So you run the risk. You can keep casting spells, but you run the risk now of rolling a miscast and dealing with the consequences of that. Now, of course, if you're a wizard, you got the wizard miscast table, and if you are a priest, you have to do penance. So there are different consequences for the different classes, but the threshold continues to grow. Now, the downside to that is that the threshold applies to all the spells. So even if you successfully cast Magic Missile, but you failed to cast your light spell, the threshold increases for all your spells, regardless of the fact that you successfully cast Magic Missile all day long. So you could potentially screw up Magic Missile, and then the spell miscast would apply because you rolled a 1 or a 2 and your threshold increased. So anyway, that's my house rule for the spell system. I like it. It works. It's been working great. for my table. But that's not the core rules. The core rules are you fail your casting check, you lose your spell. You get it back after you take a long rest. So anyway, just wanted to add that to that bullet point. All right, the next bullet point is that there is no combat grid in Shadowdark. And I really want to just kind of amend that by saying that the core rules don't require a combat grid. You can totally add a combat grid. If you like tactical combat, there's nothing stopping you from adding a combat grid. Just like in other fantasy role-playing games, you can have a grid where 1 square equals 5 feet, and you can apply the same, that same grid system to Shadowdark. It's not going to break it. The only reason why there's no combat grid is because the game does not use for movement and for ranges. It uses a system of what do they call it? Zones. That's the word, zones. Thank you. It uses a system of zones rather than a system of squares or feet per square. And so the zones in Shadowdark are close, which means that you're in melee combat, or you're basically face to face with whatever it is that you're next to. Then you have the near range, which means that you're close to something, but you are not, or that's a bad term. When you're in the near zone, then you are able to attack something with ranged weapons, but you're not able to attack it with melee weapons. And then when you are in the far zone, you're not able to attack anything. Or you may be able to attack from the far to the near, but you're not able to attack from the far to the close, unless of course you have a weapon that has that type of range. So there are 3 zones, and it's more I think it's easier used in games that rely on the theater of the mind combat, as opposed to a grid system for tactical combat. I use a combination of both. I keep to the zones, but I also if I have a battle mat out that's like 36 inches long, and I have a character that wants to go from one end to the other, then it's going to take them. They can move 30 feet. So any character can typically move 30 feet. That's the distance of a near zone is 30 feet. So they can move 30 feet, 6 squares down the battle mat on their turn, on their move. So again, it's just really easy to incorporate that into the game. It's just not a core of the game. There's no combat grid, so if you're using a battle mat, you kind of have to decide how you want to use the zone system for your battle mat, in a way that works for you. So that's what that means. The next bullet point: a round is a round, be it crawling or combat. Effects with a duration of rounds interchange seamlessly. Okay, so basically all that means is that if you're in combat, you know what a round is. It's your turn all the way around the table, then you start round 2 all the way around the table, then it's round 3. The same thing goes out of combat. So if you are in an encounter where you're role-playing with or interacting with your environment, you want to keep that same initiative system going, so that every person around the table gets an opportunity to act during that round. And it's not just one player that's hogging all of the time for that particular non-combat encounter. Okay, so the next bullet point is wizards can learn spells from spell scrolls of any spell tier. This is pretty cool, which means if you're a GM and you want your first level wizard to find a level 4 spell tier, a tier 4 spell. Let's get the brain to work this morning, shall we? If you are a DM and you want your first level wizard player to find a spell scroll with a tier 4 spell, you can totally do that. They can totally cast it after they learn it, as long as they hit that higher DC on their spell casting check. So that higher DC, if it's a tier 4 spell, it's going to require a DC of 18 or 14 in order to cast that spell. So, they can try, but they're not going to succeed as often as they would lower tier spells. But they may get a chance to shine. That level 4 or that tier 4 spell could be needed at a real crucial time during combat, and it could really make that wizard a rock star during that particular combat if they can pull it off. So anyway, yeah, so that is a possible thing. Wizards can cast any spell that they know. There's no limit to the number of spells that they can memorize. Wizards don't need a spell book. Now, that's a core conceit of the game. Wizards don't need a spell book, but I kind of like Wizards having a spell book. I think that kind of goes hand in hand. So I would say that I would say in my games anyway, the assumption is that the wizard has a spell book, and if they learn a new spell, they learn it by inscribing it in their spell book, and they have now a copy of that spell. But the rules don't require it in Shadowdark, so that's just a personal preference thing for me. So that is that bullet point. Next one is status effects and conditions are not defined. It's the game master's prerogative and duty to make fair rulings. I really don't like that particular aspect of the game, and the reason why is because for me, I try to make fair rulings, but I am not perfect, and I have a terrible memory. So I may make a ruling today on how a certain condition works. Say, let's take Petrify, for example. I may say that Petrify, if you get hit by a creature that petrifies, the first round that you're hit by this creature, you start to petrify, and you have disadvantage on attack rolls as your body slowly turns to stone. And then the second round after that, your body turns to stone. And 6 months from now, I may decide, well, you petrify immediately, or you get a saving throw or a constitution check to try to overcome the petrification, because I don't remember what I did 6 months previous. And then, your players are like, well, that's not what we did last time, and now you look like an idiot because you're doing a different thing for petrify. And that's because you haven't defined what petrify means in your game. So what I'm doing is coming up with a list of conditions, defining what those conditions are, and ensuring that I have consistency for those conditions throughout, the campaign. That's just me, because I have terrible memory, but the game itself does not require or does not have defined conditions. So, a game master is perfectly allowed to make it up on the fly. So if they want a petrify from a basilisk to be different from a petrify from a Medusa, they can totally change it up and justify it with your players by saying, hey, a basilisk is a different creature. Its petrify works differently than a Medusa. So deal with it. You can totally do that. That's your prerogative, and that's what the game allows. Not my preference, but it is a thing. All right, the next bullet point is drinking a potion or using an item as part of your multitasking. It does not take your action. So this can be a little bit controversial. I know that there's one school of thought that says, certain potions are the equivalent of taking an action, like casting a spell. Like a healing potion is like casting a healing spell, or a potion of invisibility is like casting an invisibility spell. So, you're basically breaking the action economy by allowing potions to be done as a part of your multitasking, instead of requiring that your action that it takes your action. So I agree, and I also disagree. I think that it is there's an argument to be made that a potion is like an action. Absolutely, you can totally make that argument, and I would not disagree with you. But I would say, does it really break the action economy? I would say not necessarily, and the reason why is because we allow other things to be done as part of multitasking as well. Dropping a weapon, drawing a weapon. These are things that should also take time. Should also take your action. Loading a crossbow, but we allow that to be done either in multitasking as part of your movement. So, is that really any different than drinking a potion? Again, you can argue that, but is it game breaking? Does it really destroy the action economy? And I would say no. Now, you definitely want to put limits around this. You don't want to say that drinking a potion can also be done when you are, sheathing your weapon and then pulling out another weapon. I mean, you want to limit the multitasking to common sense. If you're drinking a potion, that's all you're doing. And also, your potion has to be within reach, like on your belt. It can't be buried in your pack. If it's buried in your pack, then yeah, you're going to have to pull your pack out, dig through it, pull out your potion, then drink it. So it all depends on the situation, the scenario, and how prepared that character has for drinking as part of multitasking, drinking a potion as part of multitasking. So, that's your job as a DM to try to define those variables to determine whether or not drinking the potion would be part of your multitasking, or if you're going to require an action to take it. In most cases, I would assume that a player that is adventuring should have potions on their belt or in their satchel that they can simply just pull out, chug it, and make an attack. But you might want to ask how many potions do you have in your satchel versus how many potions you have in your backpack. Because if you got them in your backpack, it's going to take an action for you to pull that backpack off and pull out those potions. Okay, so next bullet point. Spells with duration of rounds cannot be ended early. It is the design intent that they can be if the caster is still in control of the magic. So this one I'm not too clear on. I'm not really that familiar with all the spells that I could be able to use as an example, but so my assumption here is that any spell that a caster is still in control of, to me, would be a spell that would be a focus spell. So every round they have to roll to keep the spell going. That's what that means to me. So in that case, I would say, yeah, they can stop that any time by simply ceasing their focus. But if they cast a spell like a light spell that has a defined duration, that light spell lasts for that defined duration. It does not last beyond that. So the wizard or the priest cannot shut that light spell off early. It goes until its duration runs out, and I mean, you can always cover whatever you have the light spell on and effectively dim it or eliminate the light from it, but you cannot actually stop the spell until the duration runs out. And that's what that's how I'm reading this. But I could be wrong because, again, I'm not intimately familiar with every spell as of yet. I haven't seen all the spells in play, so there could be some spells that that fall outside of that focus that could potentially be ended early. But again, I'm not up on that. So if anybody's watching has ideas on that, post it in the comments section and educate me. Okay, so the next bullet point. You can cast another non-focus spell while you are focusing. Rolling a focus check does not take your action. So that's the great thing about focus, is that you can keep that spell going. That's a focus spell, and you can cast another spell as long as it's not a focus spell. So you can only have one focus spell going at any given time, but you can cast other non-focus spells at the same time. You don't lose the ability to cast a focus spell if you fail subsequent focus checks. So you got a focus spell going and oops, you screwed up and the spell fizzles out. That doesn't mean that you lose a spell. It just means that that spell that was active is no longer active and you have to cast it again in order for it to get going again. You make a new focus check every time you take damage. So every time you take damage, that can potentially break your concentration, and therefore you are potentially going to lose that spell. So you got to make a new focus check. So that means you could be making a focus check, multiple times around if you keep taking damage throughout the round. There are no saving throws unless the spell or ability explicitly calls for a stat check to resist with. I love that. No saving throws. Your saving throws are ability checks. So if you got poison that you're trying to fight off, I'm calling for a con check. There are no attacks of opportunity. So this is great. I love this. I didn't know if I would like it initially because attacks of opportunity have been pretty much a core part of the game since 3rd edition. But what the attack of opportunity tends to do is it tends to limit mobility in a combat scenario. So once a character is in melee combat with an opponent, they tend to stay in the same position for the entire combat because moving would result in a potential attack of opportunity, and nobody wants to risk that. So basically what you have is you got, the first round, everybody moves into position, and then the rest of the combat, you have a static, combat because nobody's moving until, a creature dies, and then you can move over to attack another creature. But, until creatures die, like if you are fighting a boss monster, the boss monster's in the middle of the table, and all your players go up, all the melees go up to attack the boss monster. The ranged attackers on the outskirts shooting in. And, once that first round is over and everybody's in place, then you might as well take a picture of it because that's what it's going to look like at the end of the battle until the boss falls. Because nobody's going to risk disengaging from the boss, or else they're going to get a attack of opportunity. So that's the risk of, or that's the downside to having attacks of opportunity. Not having attacks of opportunity means that you can move in, dart out, go in, make your melee attack, climb over onto the table, jump on the chandelier, swing in, kick the guy's head, land over here, move back in, try to backstab them. You can have all of this type of movement around the opponents around the combat scene without anybody fearing an attack of opportunity. And I think that encourages a more dynamic combat scenario. So that is what I am trying to shoot for. Now, admittedly, in my face-to-face game, I haven't seen a whole lot of mobility yet because I think people are still kind of stuck with that mindset of once you're in melee, you got to stay in melee. But that's what I need to do is I need to move my monsters around more so that they have to chase the monster down and get that movement, initiate that dynamic activity on the battlefield. Okay, so the next bullet point is ranged weapons don't have a minimum attack range. So you can be in close combat with an opponent, pull out your bow and arrow and shoot him in the face, and there's no penalties or bonuses for that matter for doing so. And then the last bullet point here is torches burn for 1 hour of real life time. So I'm not sure why this is included here. This is clearly defined in the rules. Maybe it's just as a reminder because I forget all the time. I have to actually remember to set a timer on my phone or have the player set a timer on their phone whenever they light up a torch to ensure that 1 hour of real time passes and they have to light up another torch. Otherwise, it just kind of makes the whole rule for torches, no longer important. Okay, so that's the initial list here. So we have a subsequent list. I'm not sure I've read. So let's take a look and see what the additional information is here. So torch timer and rounds do not interact or intersect. So basically what that means is that your torch timer should not supersede your rounds or vice versa. So if you have a role-playing encounter that's taking a couple of hours because of the interactions between the players and the NPC, the rounds continue to go around the table like they do in combat, even though it's not a combat scenario, or even if it is a combat scenario, it takes a couple of hours. The rounds should dictate how long that particular scenario is going versus the torch timer. So, if you go around the table and you got particularly slow players or whatever, you got an intricate combat scenario with environmental effects and it's really eating up a lot of time, you don't want to penalize your players by, an hour goes by and you've only done 3 rounds of combat and your torch timer goes off. You kind of want to suspend the torch timer at that point, I would say, until that combat scenario is over, and then restart it, because it's just not really fair to the players to expect that a torch is going to burn down to nothing in 3 rounds, just because that particular scenario is taking longer than a typical scenario would take. Not sure how big a deal that is, but that is a thing. Danger level is not dependent on torchlight. Only total darkness is deadly therefrom. Okay, so danger level is an indicator of how safe an environment would be to engage in arrest, and the percentage of an encounter occurring during arrest is dependent on the danger level. So what this is saying is that you can have a torch. Having a torch does not affect the danger level. What affects the danger level is the area that you're in, not having a torch. However, if you are in total darkness, then that can affect the danger level. So yeah, I can see where that would be confusing. Dungeons and wilderness are at least unsafe. So the least state that you should assume any area in a dungeon or in the wilderness would be is the unsafe category. Game masters determine danger levels based on the environment. Okay, so if you're in an idyllic park and you've got deer and rabbits, might be considered unsafe, but come on. Bambi is probably not going to attack you or Thumper. However, if you are in the middle of a dark forest, anything can come at you at any time. So that would be considerably different environment. All right, classes roll on their talent table every odd level. Most classes get another benefit at even levels other than hit points. So yeah, I messed this up initially on my current campaign. I thought that they rolled it on every level, but they don't. They only roll the talent table every odd level. So you want to clarify that and make sure that they're doing that properly. And then, make sure that they're reading their class features in case they get another benefit on even levels. Then we have, there are no built-in rules for delaying, holding, or readying actions. It falls upon the game master to handle these types of actions. So again, these are things that cause combat to drag to a halt or to slow it down considerably. So I do not generally allow these things, but if the players really want to set something up, then I may allow for an example, I may allow for an exception for a specific situation, but not as an ongoing rule. There is no built-in handling for trying to use out-of-class weapons and armor. It falls to the game master to handle the mechanical penalties. So, wizards are not allowed to use longswords. Does that mean that they can't pick one up and swing it at somebody? No, of course not. But because they're not allowed to use it, there should be a penalty involved. And I think the easiest penalty to apply to that type of situation would be they're at a disadvantage. They roll with disadvantage when they're using a weapon that is out of class. So that, to me, is the simplest way to adjudicate that. But you may come up with other rules. You may apply an actual negative number to the attack roll if they try to use an out of class weapon, like negative -3 or -5 or whatever. That's why it says it's up to the game master to handle the mechanical penalties, because you may have a preferred way of handling that. But if it were me, I would just stick with the simplicity of the disadvantage system. Okay, that is it for the FAQs. So I hope you find this list useful. There are other things in here that are equally useful. They're just a little bit more, there's different categories in here, and there's a lot of conversation about them. So it's more than I can cover on a video, but I do want to point you to at least this server, this Discord server, so that you can read through this stuff at your leisure. And a lot of this stuff is really helpful. So I definitely recommend going out to, again, the Arcane Library, checking out the rules forum, and everything else in here is also equally useful. So that's it for today's video. That's all I got. So I want to thank you all for watching. If you're liking this stuff, consider subscribing to my videos and hitting the bell icon so that whenever I set up a new video or put up a new video, you will be notified and will be able to view it. So with that, let me let you go. Appreciate your views, and I will catch you in the next combat.